The midday sun beat down on the dusty auction grounds, where voices clashed with the sound of stamping hooves and the creak of old wooden fences. Cowboys leaned against rails, their hats pulled low, eyes sharp as coins exchanged hands and cattle were driven through. But today, it wasn't cattle that drew the crowd's attention. In the center pen, a restless young colt, Shadow, stamped the ground, his black coat glistening with sweat, eyes wide with defiance. He reared back, muscles taut, and the rope around his neck strained as two handlers struggled to keep him still. Whispers ran through the crowd. This wasn't just another animal to be sold. There was fire in him, wild and untamed, the kind of spirit men either wanted to break or feared to touch. Among the watchers stood Caleb Armstrong, a tall cowboy with shoulders weathered by years under the sun and eyes that held the weight of losses no one dared speak of. He hadn't come to buy. Truth be told, Caleb had avoided auctions ever since he lost his own herd to drought 2 summers back. Yet something about Shadow gripped him from the first moment he saw the colt fight against the ropes. It wasn't just the strength, it was the refusal to surrender. Caleb saw in the animal the same stubborn will that had kept him alive when everything else seemed stripped away. His jaw tightened as he shifted his weight, torn between walking away and stepping forward. At the auction block, Thaddeus Boone, the Lilo arrow with a booming voice and a sharp eye for profit, raised his hands. "All right, folks, we got ourselves a wild one. Young, strong, not yet broken. Who's got the courage and the pocketbook for this beauty?" His words dripped with showmanship, designed to stir the pride of men as much as their wallets. A few chuckles rose from the crowd, but most eyes narrowed, weighing risk against reward. Breaking a colt like Shadow could bring fortune, or ruin. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the colt's furious snorts and the scrape of boots shifting in the dust. Then came the voice of Judah Blackwell, a wealthy rancher whose presence was enough to sour the air. $50 to start, he called, his tone smug. Heads turned, some nodding in approval, others in resentment. Blackwell's reputation was no secret. He was a man who saw animals as tools and men as pawns. Caleb's gut clenched at the thought of Shadow ending up in his corral, beaten into submission until that fire in his eyes went dark. The cowboy's hand drifted to the brim of his hat, pulling it lower as if to shield himself from the decision forming inside him. The auctioneer's gavel hovered, waiting for more. Murmurs buzzed through the crowd as no one dared challenge Blackwell's money. For a moment, it seemed certain the colt's fate was sealed. Caleb's heart thudded against his ribs, his mind flashing to memories of nights he'd sat alone on his porch, staring at empty corrals where his horses once grazed. He had sworn never to risk again. But here he was, unable to shake the pull of the colt's wild defiance. It felt less like chance and more like fate pressing him forward. A bead of sweat rolled down Caleb's temple as he drew in a sharp breath. His voice, low but steady, broke through the tension like a crack of thunder. 60. The word hung in the air, turning every head toward him. Blackwell's smirk faltered. The crowd straightened, sensing the beginning of a contest that was no longer just about a horse. It was about pride, survival, and something far deeper that Caleb himself didn't yet understand. The air in the auction yard grew tense as if every soul present had drawn in a breath and forgotten how to let it out. Blackwell's eyes narrowed, the lazy amusement gone from his expression. He turned his head slowly toward Caleb Armstrong, studying the man as though he was some upstart who had no business standing against him. 70, Blackwell announced, his voice carrying with smug authority. The handlers tugged at Shadow's reins as the colt reared again, almost sensing the battle being waged over his freedom. Dust rose from the ground, swirling in the hot light, and silence fell once more as all eyes shifted to Caleb. Caleb shifted his stance, boots pressing deeper into the dirt. His heart thundered in his chest, though his face gave away nothing. The memory of empty corrals still clung to him, ghosts of horses that had once been his pride. Yet there was something in Shadow's wild eyes that ignited an old flame within him. 80, Caleb said, louder this time. The crowd murmured, heads tilting, impressed that the quiet rancher had not backed down. For the first time in years, Caleb felt the weight of risk pressing on him, and it tasted like iron and dust on his tongue. Thaddeus Boone clapped his hands together with theatrical delight. "Now we got ourselves a fight, folks." His booming laugh echoed across the corral. He thrived on moments like these, rivalries that fattened his purse. Blackwell's lips curled into a thin smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. 100, he fired back without hesitation, his tone sharp enough to cut. The crowd gasped, for it was no small sum. A man would need real conviction, or real desperation, to keep bidding beyond that. Boone's gavel hovered like a weapon poised to strike. Caleb swallowed hard, sweat rolling down his back beneath his shirt. He thought of his sister Naomi, who had begged him not to return to auctions, fearing the old wounds it would tear open. He thought of his father's voice echoing in memory, reminding him that a man's worth was measured not by what he lost, but by what he refused to abandon. His gaze locked on Shadow, who pawed at the ground with a furious strength, rope trembling under the strain. Caleb's chest tightened. He couldn't let that fire be extinguished by Blackwell's cruelty. 120, he declared, his voice steady as steel. The murmurs rose louder, rippling like a storm across the crowd. Some whispered Caleb had lost his senses, others leaned in, eager to witness a contest that was no longer about money. Blackwell's face darkened. His jaw ticked as he stared at Caleb, a man he had dismissed as beaten down by life. He sneered, "You don't have the land nor the coin to keep that beast, Armstrong." But beneath his words lingered the faintest edge of uncertainty. The crowd caught it, and the energy shifted like wind before lightning. Thaddeus Boone raised his gavel high, his grin stretching wide. "Going once. Going twice." The crowd held its breath as Blackwell glared at Caleb, a challenge flashing between them. Shadow kicked against the boards, snorting fiercely as if daring the men to decide his fate. Caleb's hands trembled at his sides, but his eyes never left the Colt. Whatever happened next would mark the beginning of something that would change both their lives forever. The gavel came down with a thunderous crack, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to stop. "Sold!" Thaddeus Boone shouted, his booming voice echoing through the auction yard. "To Mr. Caleb Armstrong, for $120. A roar of chatter erupted as men tipped their hats, some in respect, others in disbelief. Caleb's stomach churned, a mix of triumph and dread. The Colt was his now. Shadow belonged to him. But so did the weight of the choice he'd just made, a choice that would test not only his wallet but the remnants of his battered spirit. Blackwell's face turned the color of storm clouds. His smirk had dissolved into a thin line of fury as he stepped closer, boots crunching the dirt. "You'll regret this, Armstrong," he muttered, his voice low enough to sting like a snake's hiss. Caleb didn't answer. He tipped his hat lower, refusing to give the man the satisfaction of a response. Shadow reared again, and the handlers grunted, straining to hold him. Caleb stepped forward, his hands steady though his heart still pounded. For the first time since the drought stole his herd, he felt alive again, like he'd taken a stand that mattered. Shadow's eyes blazed with wild terror as Caleb approached the pen. The Colt's ears pinned back, nostrils flaring, every muscle on edge. Caleb stopped just shy of the gate, meeting that fiery gaze. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice low and calm, the same tone his father once used with frightened horses long ago. Memories flooded him, standing as a boy beside his father in the old barn, learning patience, learning respect. The crowd fell into a hush, watching closely, some skeptical, others curious if Caleb truly had the grit to handle such a creature. With slow, deliberate movements, Caleb reached for the rope the handlers gripped tightly. They hesitated, glancing at Boone for approval. The Lilo arrow gave a nod, eager to see if Armstrong would fall flat on his face. The handlers released the line into Caleb's hands. The raw strength of Shadow's pull jolted through him, a surge that nearly yanked him off his boots. But Caleb dug in, boots sliding in the dirt, muscles straining as he held firm. "I've got you," he whispered, voice steady despite the strain. His grip tightened, and with each breath he gave a subtle tug, not forcing, not breaking, but guiding. The colt snorted, jerking his head violently, rope whipping in the air. Caleb stood his ground, letting the wild fight burn, then eased the tension with a gentle pull. The crowd leaned in, captivated by the delicate balance, power meeting patience. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Shadow's movements shifted. His ears twitched, and though his eyes still flared, he stopped thrashing long enough to study the man at the other end of the rope. The silence was thick, broken only by the colt's ragged breaths and the creak of the pen. For a fleeting moment, Caleb saw something shift in Shadow's eyes, recognition, maybe even trust, faint but real. His chest tightened with a swell of emotion he hadn't felt in years. He knew the battle was only beginning, but this was a start. Behind him, Blackwell's glare burned hotter than the sun, a promise of vengeance that lingered like a shadow itself. Caleb ignored it, focused only on the trembling rope in his hands and the wild heart beating across from him. Caleb led Shadow out of the auction pen, the rope taut between them like a fragile bridge. The colt fought with every step, hooves striking the packed earth, nostrils flaring in protest. Men parted quickly, muttering under their breath as dust swirled up around them. Some shook their heads, convinced Caleb had thrown his money into the fire. Others leaned forward, curious if the battered rancher had more grit in him than anyone had guessed. Caleb kept his gaze forward, refusing to let doubt break his focus. Shadow's hooves clattered against the wooden planks as they reached the gate, the colt still thrashing like a storm contained in flesh and bone. At the edge of the corral, Naomi Armstrong appeared, her face pale with worry. She had heard the commotion from down the road and hurried over, skirts brushing the dirt, eyes locking on her brother. "Caleb," she hissed, voice sharp with both fear and anger, "what have you done?" Her hands clutched the fence rails as she watched the colt snort and buck. Caleb didn't look at her. He kept his attention on Shadow, every ounce of him tethered to the animal's wild rhythm. "I did what needed doing," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Naomi's lips tightened, but she said no more. She had seen this look in her brother's eyes before, stubborn, unyielding, the same that had driven him through loss and ruin. Judah Blackwell lingered nearby, his broad frame casting a shadow across the dust. He crossed his arms, his lips curling into a sneer as he called out loud enough for all to hear. "You think you can tame that beast, Armstrong? You don't even have the herd left to feed him. He'll break you before you ever break him." The crowd tittered, nervous laughter rippling through them. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. He tugged lightly on the rope, guiding Shadow another step forward. The colt resisted, muscles quivering with the urge to flee, but Caleb matched every lunge with calm resistance, refusing to overpower, refusing to yield. Evelyn Parker, standing near the fence with a basket of supplies in her arms, watched intently. Her eyes softened as she took in the scene, not just the wild struggle of the colt but the quiet determination of the man holding the rope. She had heard whispers about Caleb Armstrong, the man who had once run a thriving ranch before disaster stripped it from him. She hadn't expected to see him here, reclaiming a piece of himself through a creature everyone else feared. Her hand pressed lightly against her chest as Shadow's hooves struck sparks on the boards, and she found herself silently willing Caleb to succeed. The sun slid lower, painting the yard in long shadows as Caleb finally eased Shadow toward the hitching post. Sweat streaked his temples, his arms trembling from the effort, but he never let go. With one final lunge, Shadow reared, pawing the air, then came down with a heavy snort. The rope slackened just slightly, and for the first time the colt stood still, head high, chest heaving, but still. Caleb drew in a slow breath, steadying himself as he loosened his grip. The crowd murmured again, softer this time, their doubt giving way to something resembling respect. But Caleb knew this was only the beginning. A battle had been won, not the war. Shadow's spirit was still unbroken, and Blackwell's venomous glare promised more trouble ahead. As Naomi's anxious eyes met his, and Evelyn's quiet admiration lingered from the fence, Caleb felt the weight of what lay before him. He had crossed a threshold, one that would either restore him or destroy him completely. Night settled heavy over the Armstrong homestead, the sky above clear and cold, stars scattered like silver dust. Caleb had tethered Shadow in the small corral behind the barn, giving the colt space to move but not enough to bolt. The animal's dark coat shimmered under the moonlight, every muscle taut, eyes glowing with the same fierce defiance from earlier. Caleb leaned on the fence rails, his body aching from the day's fight, but his mind refused to rest. He had staked more than money in that auction yard. He had staked what little pride he had left. And pride was a fragile thing, harder to rebuild than a barn burned to the ground. Inside the farmhouse, Naomi watched him through the window, worry carving lines deeper into her face. She remembered the last time her brother had taken a gamble like this. The drought had swallowed their herd, leaving debts and silence where laughter once lived. She wanted to pull him inside, to remind him they couldn't afford another broken dream. But when she saw the way Caleb stood, rooted firm against the night, she swallowed her words. His stubbornness was both his strength and his curse. Instead, she wrapped her shawl tighter and whispered a prayer into the quiet. Shadow tested the rope again, jerking hard enough to send dust flying. Caleb's hand closed over the rail, knuckles whitening. "Easy, boy," he murmured into the dark. His voice carried low, steady, like a thread weaving through the night. The colt's ears twitched, but he stamped the ground defiantly. Caleb's mind drifted back to his father's lessons, how patience could tame what brute force never could. He had seen men beat the spirit out of horses, leaving hollow creatures that obeyed but never trusted. Caleb would not do that to Shadow. Not now, not ever. Out on the ridge, a lone rider paused, watching the glow of the Armstrong lanterns flicker against the dark. Judah Blackwell sat tall in his saddle, his hat brim low, eyes fixed on the small corral. His jaw clenched as he imagined the colt under his ownership, broken and profitable. That Armstrong had dared to defy him stung deeper than the lost bid. Blackwell was not a man who forgave insults, and Caleb had drawn a line in the dirt he would come to regret. The rancher turned his horse slowly, retreating into the night, the promise of retribution burning hotter than any fire. Back at the corral, the struggle softened for just a moment. Shadow's head dipped, breath loud and steady, and Caleb saw the faintest crack in the wall of the animal's fear. He didn't smile, didn't move too quickly. He only whispered again, his words little more than a vow, "We'll figure this out, you and me." The colt's ears flicked forward, and though the fight still simmered beneath his skin, the night held a fragile truce. Caleb finally turned toward the house, exhaustion pulling at his steps. But as he crossed the yard, he knew sleep would not come easy. Something had begun that day, something larger than him, larger than Shadow. The echoes of hooves, the sting of Blackwell's threats, and the weight of Naomi's fear all pressed in. Tomorrow would bring new battles, and Caleb could only hope he was ready for them. The morning broke with a pale gold light spilling across the valley, mist clinging to the edges of the fields. Caleb rose before dawn, his body stiff but his will unshaken. Shadow was still in the corral, pacing restlessly, his mane damp with dew. The colt's eyes caught the first rays of the sun, glowing like embers that refused to die. Caleb carried a bucket of water and a small sack of oats, each step deliberate, each breath steady. He knew this morning would set the tone, whether Shadow would see him as another hand that forced control or as someone worth trusting. Naomi stood at the doorway, her arms folded tightly against her chest. "You're wasting what little we have," she called softly, though the bite in her words betrayed her fear. Caleb didn't look back. He lowered the bucket into the corral, the clank of metal startling Shadow into a sideways leap. "He's not a waste," Caleb replied, his voice low but firm. "He's a chance." Naomi shook her head, but deep down she recognized the same resolve that had carried her brother through years of hardship. It frightened her, but she couldn't extinguish it. Shadow eyed the bucket warily, his ears twitching at every sound. Caleb didn't rush him. He leaned against the fence, arms folded, waiting in silence as the colt pawed the ground. The oats smelled rich, tempting, and after long moments Shadow edged forward, snorting at the rim. When his lips finally brushed the grain, Caleb's breath eased. It was a small victory, but in the world of taming, the smallest steps mattered most. He didn't move closer, didn't break the fragile thread of trust beginning to weave between them. From down the road, Evelyn Parker approached, her basket swinging lightly at her side. She stopped by the fence, watching with quiet admiration. "He's wild," she said gently, her voice carrying warmth instead of judgment. Caleb nodded without looking away from Shadow. "So was I once." The words slipped out before he could stop them, surprising even himself. Evelyn tilted her head, studying him with eyes that saw more than he wished to share. For a moment, the silence between them was heavier than the morning mist. The spell broke when hoofbeats thundered in the distance. Dust rose from the road as a group of riders approached, men from Blackwell's ranch. They slowed as they neared the Armstrong property, their faces grim, their eyes full of unspoken threats. Naomi stiffened at the doorway, her hand clutching the frame. Evelyn's gaze hardened, worry flashing across her features. Caleb straightened, his body tense, every muscle ready. He knew this was no friendly visit. Blackwell hadn't wasted a night before sending his shadow to loom over them. The riders didn't dismount. They lingered at the fence line, silent but menacing, their presence alone a message. Shadow snorted sharply, stomping the ground as if sensing the tension in the air. Caleb met the rider's eyes, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Tell Blackwell if he wants words, he knows where to find me. Until then, stay off my land." The men exchanged looks, then turned their horses slowly, retreating down the road. Dust lingered in their wake, but the promise of conflict hung even heavier. Caleb's grip on the fence tightened. The real fight had only just begun. The Armstrong ranch felt smaller after the riders left, their silence echoing louder than any shouted threat. Naomi paced the kitchen floor, her skirts rustling as she muttered, "He won't stop, Caleb. Blackwell won't let this go." Caleb sat at the table, elbows on the worn wood, his hat resting beside him. The lamplight carved shadows across his tired face. "I know," he admitted, his voice low, steady as stone. "But I can't turn back now." He rubbed his hands together, still feeling the tension of the rope, the weight of Shadow's wild defiance. That horse wasn't just an animal to him anymore. He was a mirror of everything Caleb had lost and everything he still hoped to protect. Outside, Shadow paced the corral, his dark figure cutting across the moonlight like a restless spirit. Caleb rose and stepped out into the cool night air. The smell of hay and earth filled his lungs as he approached the fence. "Easy, boy," he whispered, leaning on the rail. The colt stopped, ears flicking, eyes gleaming with suspicion. Caleb could almost feel the distance between them shrink with every breath. Shadow was still wild, still dangerous, but something had begun to shift, a fragile thread binding man and beast through sheer endurance. Behind him, Evelyn Parker's voice carried softly. "You're risking everything, Caleb." She stood by the gate, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. "The land, your name, your sister's peace." He turned toward her, the weight of her concern pressing deeper than he cared to admit. "I've lost more than I can count already," he said. "But if I give him up, if I let Blackwell crush him, then I lose what little I've got left." His eyes darkened. "And I can't let that happen." Evelyn searched his face, then gave the smallest nod, as if she understood something words couldn't carry. The next day dawned hot and merciless, dust rising from every step. Caleb brought Shadow into the training pen for the first time, the rope taut, the colt's hooves tearing furrows into the earth. Men from town gathered along the fence, drawn by word of the Armstrong's new prize. Whispers filled the air, some mocking, others doubtful, a few daring to hope he might succeed. Caleb ignored them all, his world narrowing to the rhythm of Shadow's movements, the violent lunges, the sharp rears, the furious snorts that rattled the boards. Sweat poured down his back, but he stood firm, patient, unyielding. Judah Blackwell appeared among the onlookers, his presence casting a dark weight across the crowd. He leaned on the fence, his smirk sharp as a blade. "Break him if you can, Armstrong," he called, his voice dripping with contempt. "But you'll break yourself first." Caleb didn't answer. He held Shadow's rope tighter, his gaze never leaving the colt's wild eyes. For an instant, the crowd hushed as horse and man locked into a battle older than words, a struggle for trust, for dominance, for survival itself. And then, just as Shadow lunged again, something shifted. The colt's hooves struck the ground, but instead of jerking away, he slowed, circling Caleb with wary steps. The crowd gasped, voices rising in disbelief. Caleb's chest tightened, breath caught between relief and wonder. For the first time, Shadow had chosen not to fight. Blackwell's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing with something colder than anger, fear of a bond he could never buy. The crowd dispersed slowly, murmurs lingering in the hot air like the aftertaste of gunpowder. Some shook their heads, others whispered that maybe Caleb Armstrong had something more than stubborn pride. Blackwell lingered longer than the rest, his jaw set tight, eyes fixed on the colt that had begun to circle with a hint of respect instead of rebellion. He spat in the dirt before striding off, the dust of his boots a promise that he would return. Caleb knew better than to take the man's silence as surrender. Blackwell was plotting, and plots from men like him were poison. That evening, Caleb walked Shadow back to the small corral behind the barn. The colt resisted less this time, though every muscle still vibrated with tension. Naomi watched from the porch, her arms folded tight, her worry unmasked. "You're making enemies we can't afford," she warned, her voice sharp as the crack of a whip. Caleb met her eyes, weary but resolute. "Enemies find us whether we choose them or not," he replied. "I won't let Blackwell strip this place of the little dignity we have left." Naomi shook her head, but the fight in her brother's tone left no room for argument. Inside the barn, Caleb laid out fresh hay, the earthy smell mixing with the warmth of lantern light. Shadow pawed the ground, eyes darting nervously, but when Caleb set the bucket of oats down, the colt stepped closer without as much hesitation. Caleb knelt slowly, his hand hovering just above the grain. For a breathless moment, Shadow's muzzle brushed against his fingers. Caleb froze, heart pounding, afraid any movement would shatter the fragile trust forming between them. A hush seemed to fall over the barn, the silence sacred. Then, as quickly as it came, the colt jerked back, nostrils flaring, retreating into the shadows. Still, the moment had been real, and it was enough to keep Caleb's hope alive. Word of the scene spread through town by nightfall. Evelyn Parker stopped by with a loaf of bread, her curiosity shining in her eyes. "They're saying you've done the impossible," she said softly as she handed him the bread. Caleb gave a faint smile. "They're saying too much too soon. He's not tamed. Not yet." Evelyn tilted her head. "Maybe not. But he's choosing to trust you. That means something." Her words lingered with him long after she left, carrying both comfort and a weight of expectation he hadn't asked for. Meanwhile, in the dim back room of the saloon, Blackwell sat with his men, his face hard under the glow of the lantern. "Armstrong thinks he can make a fool of me," he growled, slamming his fist against the table. "No man challenges Judah Blackwell and walks away with victory." His men nodded, the scrape of chairs and the clink of glasses punctuating the vow. Plans were laid in whispers thick with menace, schemes that would stretch beyond coin into violence. Back at the ranch, Caleb leaned against the barn door, staring at the dark silhouette of Shadow inside. The night was still, save for the soft rustle of hay and the Colt's steady breathing. For the first time in years, Caleb felt the stirrings of purpose, fragile but alive. Yet beyond the fences and the fields, danger gathered like thunderheads on the horizon, promising a storm neither man nor beast could outrun. The morning broke heavy with unease. A thin haze hung over the Armstrong ranch, the kind that made a man feel watched even when no one was near. Caleb stepped into the yard, his boots sinking into damp earth, and found Shadow waiting at the corral gate. The Colt's ears flicked forward, his dark eyes steady, no longer burning with pure defiance but with something sharper, awareness. Caleb reached out, brushing the rope with steady hands, and for the first time Shadow didn't flinch. It felt like progress carved from stone, slow and hard-earned, but progress nonetheless. Naomi emerged from the house, her shawl wrapped tightly against the morning chill. "They say Blackwell's been asking after you in town," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound strong. Caleb met her gaze, the weight of her fear pressing deep into his chest. "Let him ask," he replied evenly. "I'll be here, and so will Shadow." Naomi's lips parted as if to argue, but she stopped. She could see in her brother's eyes that he had crossed a line he couldn't step back from. This fight wasn't about horses anymore. It was about dignity, survival, and the right to stand his ground. By midday, Evelyn Parker arrived, her face pale with worry. "Caleb," she whispered urgently, "I overheard men at the saloon. Blackwell's planning something tonight. They mean to hurt you, maybe worse. You can't stay here." Caleb's jaw tightened, his hand resting on the corral rail. "If I run, he wins. If I fight, at least it's on my land." Evelyn's eyes brimmed with frustration and fear. "You're stubborn enough to die for pride," she accused, but her voice cracked with emotion. Caleb glanced at Shadow, the Colt stamping the earth as if echoing his resolve. "Not for pride," he said quietly. "For what's right." As the sun dipped low, the air grew heavier, thick with the weight of an unspoken promise. Caleb prepared quietly, setting tools aside, checking the latch on the barn door. Shadow paced restlessly, snorting into the wind, sensing the storm approaching. Naomi lit lanterns in the windows, her hands trembling, her prayers whispered like fragile threads against the dark. Evelyn stayed as well, despite Caleb's protests, her presence a silent vow that he would not face the night alone. The ranch, once so small and quiet, now felt like the stage of something larger, something destined to break them or bind them forever. Dusk bled into night, and the first sounds came. Hoofbeats pounding against the earth, voices muffled in the distance, the metallic glint of rifles catching moonlight. Blackwell's men rode up the ridge like shadows come alive, their silhouettes stretching long across the land. Caleb stood at the corral, rope in hand, Shadow pressing close behind the rails. "It's time," Caleb muttered under his breath, squaring his shoulders. He wasn't just protecting a horse anymore. He was defending the last piece of his soul that Blackwell hadn't managed to break. The riders fanned out, their laughter sharp and cruel, cutting through the night. Blackwell himself dismounted, his boots striking the ground with authority, his eyes glinting with malice. "Step aside, Armstrong," he sneered, voice thick with arrogance. "That colt was mine the moment he hit the auction pen." Caleb's chest rose with a slow, steady breath, his hand tightening on the rope. Behind him, Shadow snorted, pawing the ground like thunder building in the earth. Caleb's voice rang clear, steady as iron. "You'll have to take him over my dead body." The standoff stretched in the night air, silence hanging heavier than the smell of sweat and leather. Blackwell smirked, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. His men shifted in their saddles, rifles gleaming faint under the moonlight. Caleb stood alone in the corral's glow, his hands steady on the rope. Shadow's muscles bunched and coiled, nostrils flaring as if he too sensed the battle about to break. The Colt was no longer just a wild creature. He was a symbol, living proof that not everything could be bought or broken. "You've got one chance to step aside," Blackwell growled, his voice sharp enough to cut through the tension. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. "You had your chance at the block," he said evenly. "You lost it." For a moment, all was still, the two men locked in a battle deeper than coin. Then Blackwell's face twisted, and he lunged forward, hands snapping down toward his revolver. Gasps broke from the onlookers gathered at a distance, their voices carrying like the wind. Before steel cleared the holster, Shadow reared with a piercing cry, hooves striking the air like hammers of thunder. The sudden motion startled the men, their horses sidestepping nervously. Caleb seized the moment, tugging the rope to steady the Colt while keeping his eyes locked on Blackwell. The rancher froze, thrown off balance not by Caleb's words, but by the raw defiance embodied in the animal behind him. "This isn't just about a horse," Caleb said, his voice steady as iron. "It's about every man you've crushed under your boot. Tonight, that ends." The crowd's murmur swelled as Sheriff Vernon Hayes emerged from the darkness, rifle resting in his arms. "That's enough, Blackwell," the sheriff called, his tone flat but final. "You draw that gun, you'll answer to me and every witness here." Blackwell's men stiffened, glancing uneasily at one another. The sheriff's reputation was as solid as bedrock, fair, but merciless when the law was broken. Blackwell's hand trembled on his revolver, then slowly withdrew. His glare burned with venom, but the weight of the law, and the crowd's eyes, pinned him where he stood. Defeated but not humbled, Blackwell spat into the dirt. "This isn't over, Armstrong," he hissed before swinging onto his horse. His men followed, retreating into the dark like wolves driven back by fire. The night air seemed to exhale as the hoofbeats faded, leaving only the quiet rustle of the fields and the steady sound of Shadow's breathing. Caleb loosened his grip on the rope, his chest heaving with relief and exhaustion. The battle was done, for now. Naomi rushed forward, her arms wrapping around her brother, tears shining in her eyes. Evelyn stood nearby, her gaze fixed on Caleb with quiet admiration. Caleb looked back at Shadow, who lowered his head just enough for the rope to slacken between them. For the first time, man and Colt stood together without force, without fear, bound by something deeper than ownership. Caleb brushed his hand lightly against Shadow's neck, a silent vow of trust renewed. The ranch was still fragile, the future uncertain, but in that moment he knew they had won more than a fight. They had reclaimed hope.